So the question is, do your EZdrummer tracks sound small, spiky, unflattering, unglued together, and just strange sounding when trying to mix them? If this is the case, and if you want to improve your results and produce more professional sounding mixes when using EZdrummer or any other drum software for that matter, you're gonna wanna learn this #1 compression mixing trick that I'm gonna share with you in this tutorial. Let's dive into it. So before we dive into today's tutorial, I just want to let you know that we live in the absolute best time in history to be a rock or metal musician. We can record 100% professional sounding productions right in our home studios due to these amazing tools called MIDI drums and amp sims. The problem is that so many of us make the exact same mistakes over and over and over again when using these tools, and it unfortunately holds our productions back from sounding professional. And the thing is, I don't want this for you. I want you to produce professional results with the gear and tools you already have. And because of this, you could have direct access to my MIDI drums and amp sims production checklist. This simple checklist highlights the key areas where so many of us go wrong when using MIDI drums and amp sims, so you could be aware of these mistakes and avoid them and get right to producing better results again with the MIDI drums and amp sims that you're currently using. You could produce 100% professional results with pretty much any of these tools these days, and I don't want you struggling. I don't want you making these same mistakes that we all make, and I want you to skip them and get right to making great sounding music. You could have direct access to the guide for absolutely free. There's a link below in this video's description. Now, if there's one struggle that I hear the most when it comes to home recordists, it's dealing with MIDI drums and getting them to sound natural, big, and professional within a production as a whole. Now, what I'm about to share with you in this tutorial can be applied to any MIDI drum software, not only EZdrummer. It's just that so many of my audience uses EZdrummer, myself included, so I'm using EZdrummer as an example. But again, this relates to all MIDI drum software. People often complain that their MIDI drums either sound too flat, too sterile, unnatural, too spiky, too strange. And to be honest with you, a lot of it comes down to just a misuse of compression on your MIDI drums. Here's the thing that we all have to remember. MIDI drums are not real drums. And these companies like Toontrack do an amazing job making the drums, the MIDI drums, sound great right within the box itself or right within the plugin. Meaning you don't have to do a whole lot to them to make them sound professional within your mix. They are already processed. Now, I know people will tell me, oh, well, my MIDI drum software are raw samples. Here's the thing. I've worked with a lot of different clients, a lot of clients that record their own music. I've heard these raw drum samples coming from multiple MIDI drum programs, and I've yet to hear ones that are actually real raw drum samples. Usually they are processed to some extent, and EZdrummer is no exception. The problem is that most people that use EZdrummer will watch YouTube tutorials where the engineer or producer is mixing live drums. The techniques that you use when you're mixing live drums are rarely applicable to MIDI drums, especially a program like EZdrummer that's already processed at the source. Now, in my opinion, Toontrack has done an amazing job making EZdrummer sound great right out the gate, so we don't have to make things complicated. So let's look at some audio samples here, and then I'm gonna reveal to you what you should be doing to your EZdrummer tracks if you're looking for more professional sounding results. Now, the sample that I have pulled up right here in my DAW is a typical example of what most home studio mixes that utilize EZdrummer end up sounding like, especially the ones that people send me. Let's take a listen to the sample, and then I'm gonna dive deep and explain to you what's going wrong with this drum mix. Let's check it out. As you can hear, not very good. The drums sound really small, really papery, and weirdly spiky at the same time. It's almost like the drums are too quiet and too loud at the same time. And they also don't sound glued together at all, which is ironic because I'm utilizing techniques that should be gluing my drums together. And I think this is where a lot of people end up making the mistake, and which causes their mixes to sound very, very unprofessional. So the mistake is simple. If we look at all of the individual tracks, for example, here is my kick drum track. I've got a ton of EQ on the kick drum track. Let's look at how much gain reduction is taking place in my compressor. A bunch of compression. Let's look at my snare drum. 18 dB of compression on my snare drum. Now you have to remember, these are EZdrummer sounds that I'm processing this way. And like I've said, EZdrummer is already compressed and EQ'd at the source, meaning the samples in the plugin already have processing on them. And when you overprocess, like I'm doing here, you end up with very terrible sounding results. Now to cap the whole thing off, I also have some parallel compression on my drum bus. I have the mix knob on the compressor set to about 33% wet. Let's see what's going on in the compressor. Now you would think the parallel compression on these EZdrummer tracks would help glue the drums together, but that's not the case. All of the processing that's going on the individual tracks is just way too overkill and is destroying the natural great tone of my EZdrummer plugin. I would say over half, maybe even closer to, 75% of the mixes that people send me that utilize MIDI drums suffer from this issue. And I don't want this for you. I'm gonna share with you the true secret, the true compression secret for achieving a nice round drum mix from your MIDI drums. Now for this tutorial, I'm actually using the Metal Machines kit. Yes, I'm using EZdrummer 2. I also own EZdrummer 3, but when this song was produced, I used EZdrummer 2. That's why I didn't switch it out, but the results are going to be the same. Also, again, regardless of the MIDI drum software that you use, I hear this issue across the board. So I have the exact same outputs from that same EZdrummer plugin going to another mix in my DAW, where I'm utilizing an approach that I would use within my own productions. Let's take a listen to these drum tracks. So just to quickly compare, let's listen to the first drum mix. So as you can hear, the drums sound way more full, way more professional, and way more glued together. The ironic thing is that I'm using next to no processing on the second drum mix, and I'm going overboard with compression and EQ on the first drum mix. And the second drum mix sounds exponentially better. Now I am using some processing. Specifically, I'm using compression in a slightly different way, and it's the way that I like to compress my MIDI drum tracks. Specifically, when I'm using a program like EZdrummer, where I'm not using my own samples, I'm using just the sounds from the drum software. So if we look at my kick drum, first of all, there's no EQ on my kick drum because it's not necessary, because the kick drum coming from EZdrummer is already EQ'd. And I'm only using a little bit of EQ on my snare, just rolling off the deep lows and pulling out a smidge of lower mids, just a smidge. But the big thing here is the compression. I wanted a little more smack out of my kick and snare, but I did not want to destroy the transient, making the drums sound overly squashed and overly spiky and overly strange, causing them to sound small. I want them to sound nice, round, and big. Let's look at how much gain reduction is taking place in the kick drum compressor. So around 3 to 4 to 6 at the most, a little less than the bad drum mix. But the main takeaway here is what's going on the snare drum. Let's take a look at how much gain reduction is taking place on the snare drum. Way less compression, around 4 dB of gain reduction. Now, let me say this, when it comes to compressing live drums, I like to whack my snare with 18 dB of compression, a ton of EQ, all that good stuff. But we have to remember, again, MIDI drums, even if they're marketed as being raw drum samples, are generally not. And there's some form of compression already applied in the samples within the plugin itself. You don't have to overdo it with processing. Specifically compression, that's where people really go wrong. EQ also, but I would say compression is probably the main culprit. Now, as far as the rest of my drums, I'm not touching the snare down. I'm not touching the hi-hat. The toms are already nice and processed in this particular drum pack, so I'm not processing the toms. As far as the overheads, I'm not using any compression at all. I'm using a little bit of basic filtering just to thin out the overheads. And on my room tracks, I'm not doing any processing outside of just delaying them by 15 milliseconds, just to make the room sound a little bigger. No EQ, no compression. Again, the source is already processed and sounds great. Now, here's a little bonus tip for you as far as compression on EZdrummer. If you go easy with the compression on the individual tracks and you do it tastefully, only by a few dB, and you don't go crazy with EQ, and you let the EZdrummer tracks sound the way they were meant to sound and the way that the engineer produced them in the first place, you can apply some parallel compression on your drum bus, and it's gonna generally be pretty pleasing if you do it within reason. So right here, I'm using my favorite drum bus compressor. Let's see what's going on as far as gain reduction. So around 8 dB of gain reduction, but I have the mix set to only around 27%. So it's mainly dry with a little bit of that parallel compression blended in. Now I'm using the Waves G Master bus compressor, which is my favorite drum bus compressor as well as my favorite master bus compressor. People ask me about this all the time. If you're interested in checking it out, I will leave a link below in this video's description. I've been using this plugin for almost 20 years now. It's my go-to. And full disclosure, the link in the description is an affiliate link. So if you decide to purchase the plugin, you'll be helping to support me and the channel. From time to time, I will experiment with other bus compressors, but this one is definitely my go-to and definitely my favorite. So again, because I use processing sparingly on the individual EZdrummer tracks within the second drum mix, I can get away with a little more parallel compression, and it helps glue the sound of the drums together as a whole. What a lot of people will tend to do is they overdo it both on the individual tracks and on the drum bus, and that's how you end up with the result like you heard earlier in this tutorial. You know what I mean, that small, squash, spiky, strange, obvious programmed drum sound, which I cannot stand. I personally love programmed drums, but I like when they actually sound like real drums. That's just me. So what I want you to take away from this tutorial is to keep in mind, if you're working with MIDI drums, you don't have to go crazy with compression. Sometimes you don't need to use compression at all. In this particular mix, I'm only compressing the kick and snare very, very little, and then using a little bit of tasteful parallel compression on the drum submix. It didn't need any more outside of that. And again, if you're struggling with your productions and you're using MIDI drums and amp sims, I want you to bypass all of the struggles that so many of us face, myself included once upon a time. And you can avoid these mistakes by downloading my MIDI drums and amp sims production checklist. Again, it highlights all the common mistakes that so many of us fall victim to, and it'll allow you to bypass them so you can produce better sounding music with the MIDI drums and amp sims you currently have. There's a link below to the free guide in this video's description. You can click it and download it and have instant access right now. So I'm curious to know, are you guilty of this compression mistake when mixing your MIDI drums? If so, leave a comment in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your opinion. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And don't forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload one of my weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. Until next time, happy mixing.